Hi everyone, and welcome to the Netgain Cybersecurity webinar series. Today we'll be talking about how you can make cybersecurity part of your culture to help keep your organization cyber secure. Before we jump into introducing our speaker and today's agenda, I wanted to quickly go over just a few housekeeping items for today's session. First, and with every webinar that we always do, we really want to focus on education, and so I always encourage you to use the chat box or the question box in the sidebar to ask any questions throughout the webinar. Usually we'll focus on having a 60-minute or so discussion with time for questions at the end. So maybe working back from that and making sure that we have enough time to address those questions that you may have. So because we'll sometimes address those questions during the middle of the webinar, if it makes sense to interject and ask that question when we're on a particular slide, would just encourage you to use that chat box throughout the webinar to get those questions in. I know everyone always asks, so yes, we are recording today's webinar, and we'll send you a webinar recording, the on-demand replay that you can watch after the webinar. We should get that sent out to you in the next day or two, and you'll be able to review anything that we talk about here today. And then finally, just as a quick disclaimer, not all of the strategies and techniques that we discuss here today will be the best option for your organization. Cybersecurity is something that needs to be customized and tailored for each individual organization. So just make sure you check with your IT team or your security team or your IT partner first before you implement any of these strategies that we talk about. I know our audience today includes a mix of Netgain clients and organizations we haven't yet had a chance to work with. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Netgain, quite simply, we just focus on making your IT worry-free. We really want to be able to have you focus on other areas of your business that might need your attention. We're a niche IT and cloud services company that specializes in helping healthcare practices, financial services firms, and law firms lower their IT costs, improve their efficiencies, and especially protect their organization and much, much more. So with that obligatory promotional slide out of the way, let's meet our speaker for today's session. Today we're joined by Bill Sorensen. He's a cloud computing and cybersecurity expert. He has over 15 years of experience in the cloud technology space, so he's certainly seen a lot of iterations and growth as technology has continued to advance. Through that time, he's created and led cutting-edge technology solutions for decades and just continues to speak on cloud computing, optimized organizations, and cybersecurity best practices. My name's Phil Woken. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Netgain and will help facilitate today's discussion, but really I want to make sure that Bill has the floor and can help us walk us through today's topic. So thanks for joining us today, Bill.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for the nice intro. Excuse me, I got a little cold hanging on, so I apologize ahead of time if periodically you hear me go on mute for a couple seconds. I'll try not to cough during the presentation. But great timing for this. It's a huge topic and continues to be a huge topic, so really excited to be able to present to the group today.
Oh, perfect. So just kind of going over a quick agenda for today's session, just so you all can know what to expect as we cover off on a lot of different topics. We're first going to talk, just address some key terms and definitions to make sure everybody's on the same page. We always like to talk about some of the current cyber crime and cyber attacks that we read about in the news and how that relates. But then also too, just diving a little bit deeper and looking at, who are the criminals, why they're doing this, what does a cyber secure organization look like, and then also some discussion around where are you now and how do you fill those gaps to really make your organization cyber secure and build that into the culture. And then also just some of that progress that you can make today as we kind of pull everything together and button everything up at the end. So I think that should cover off on quite a few different topics, Bill. So you want to kick us off and talk through some key terms and definitions?
You bet. I like to start out this specific presentation around this because getting a base understanding of how we talk about these things helps as we kind of dive in. So first, when we look at compliance, it depends on your organization and what industry you're in as to what compliance regulations you're under. So whether it's a healthcare practice or an accounting firm or wealth management firm, each organization has compliance guidelines and requirements, as well as oversight and many times audit as it relates to that. And specifically, I want to talk about the difference between compliance and security or cybersecurity. And so as we look at cybersecurity, we're looking at creating the best solution for your organization so that it's defensible, so that you're doing everything you can to stop somebody from getting access to information that they shouldn't have, using your staff to do nefarious things, using your equipment to do things that you're not expecting it to do. And so compliance relates specifically to the requirements for your organization to, be a really a good organization in standing with that compliance overview. Security goes significantly beyond that. It's somewhat parallel, and many of the items have crossover. But on the security side, we're going to look for some more significant controls that your compliance may not look at. So just want to have that in your mind. Now, when we talk about controls, we're really looking at three different types of controls. Technical controls, and those can be security groups, technical user IDs and passwords, those kinds of things to restrict access. Physical controls many times relate to either the computer center or actually your offices. When somebody gets in your office, do you have controls in place so that you're restricting them from getting into areas and getting access to technology, in this example, that they shouldn't have? And then administrative is interesting, and this is a place that consistently we see organizations struggle with. And these are the policy and procedures and the controls that we try and place around people and people's activities. Many times these are well documented in an organization, but staff may not know what they are or may not think they're as important as they are. So we'll talk about controls periodically here. And then this idea of when something happens, we call it an incident. So something gets exposed, possibly it could be HIPAA data, it could be a tax return that got emailed without being encrypted. That's an incident. And then what we want to do is we want to take a look at that incident and determine, was there a breach? And then a breach really relates to exposure. Was something exposed? What was exposed? And then what are your requirements around that exposure? So that'll come into play as well. And then the last item I have here is incident response. And that's this analysis of something went on. We have to have a plan in place that says, let's look at that, and then let's determine the correct response. In some cases, there's no response needed in terms of communicating with your compliance organization or your clients or your vendors. In other situations, those things are going to be key. So let's go on and take a quick peek at what's going on today in the news as it relates to cybercrime. And this is interesting, and so this is something that I try and do the week before presentation. So these are current headlines. Almost all of these are within the last week. A couple are within the last few weeks. But we continue to see dramatic impact to organizations around cybercrime. On the healthcare side, we saw a significant report come out that talked about employees in a healthcare organization selling and being willing to sell client information. So that's a significant fraud piece that was a common place in this analysis of the industry. Another one is the Voya pays $1 million to settle an SEC charges over their cybersecurity breach. Again, these hackers had gotten access to a portal that provided significant amount of data about their customers. And you can see the others here. The interesting thing I think to take away from this slide is you can literally Google cybercrime today, click on the news tab, and you can see constantly these breaches that are happening. Now, we just saw Facebook had a recent tens of millions of accounts breach. And then I think it was just even last week that Google came out and said they're turning off Google Plus, which was kind of their attempt at social media because of a significant breach that happened earlier. Now, these are so commonplace that people just glaze over them now. If you think back to probably the big Target breach that released credit card information, that was huge, that stayed around for a long time. The Equifax breach last year stayed around for a long time. But this idea that this is commonplace and that your private individual information and your organization's information is out there, those are things we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis and really understand that that's a reality that we're living in today. So let's take a look at excuse me, who these criminals are and why they're doing this. So as we look at these, we used to think about these individuals or groups as these hackers in the basement, excuse me, and kind of the Hollywood profiled that for a number of years, and kind of made it attractive to be that person. What we see today is a dramatically different approach to this. We see, and they typically split them into people we call mules, professionals, nation-state actors, activists, gateways, and insiders. And then within each of these groups, there's different attack methods and what they're actively doing, from working to launder money to working to get you to wire transfer payments that you'd typically pay a vendor and redirect that vendor's electronic payment to someone else, to tax returns, posting tax returns to the IRS that have fraudulent account information so the returns go elsewhere. And these are tens of millions and in some cases billions of dollars ultimately that get redirected. And so it's a huge, huge moneymaker. The other thing is these are extremely organized, really companies today. There was a good example of that. An Indian firm, excuse me, East Indian firm got closed down earlier this year that had over 700 people in employ, and they were delivering ransomware across the world. So they had 700 employees whose job it was to deliver ransomware everywhere they can. The other thing we're seeing is these attacks are extremely systematic. We used to think that, people would send out phishing emails to try and get you to do something, and then they'd collect small amounts of money from people who did things. Today, they're targeting organizations. They're building organizational charts of your firm or practice. They're then assigning people to watch you via social media, anywhere you've got a footprint, whether it's LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or those kinds of things, and then watch what you're doing so they know when, if you post, oh, we're going on vacation, they know that's happening, and that's a trigger for them to attempt to do something as it relates to you. healthcare information and financial information are both extremely valuable today and saleable today, and that's what they're continuing to do. The other thing I want to point out is, we read about these other organizations. We read about hospitals getting significant ransomware. We read about financial institutions getting huge fines. We read about these really public, large exposures. You just have to understand that that is you. It's not the other companies anymore. It's not, oh, that's somebody else down the street. The reality of it is you're in that mix today if you're in these industries. So let's take a look at what does that cyber secure organization look like. What's our goal with this? And I like to talk about this, and the direction has been toward this what they call a zero trust approach. And so you'll hear me talk about that as we go through this. So when we think about a cyber secure organization, we're looking for an organization that has extremely good controls in place. So when a user wants access to something, we know it's them. It's not like them. It's not just their user ID and password. We know it's them. So we need that in place. The other piece is we want to know it's a device that we know, so that if we think it's you, but that device is coming from Brazil, we know it's not you. So we really want to control that access into your world. We really want to control that on the physical side too. I'm focusing here on the electronic side. The last piece of this is this idea of least privilege access. And what that means is, the days are gone where if you're the CFO, you've got full access to every piece of information in the organization. The goal here is to have you have exactly access to the information you need and no more. So based on your job, you're going to have access to exactly what you need. By limiting the exposure to other information that you don't have, we actually do a significant amount of progress toward limiting the exposure of the organization. So that's our goal with this. So how do we do this? We do it via a very strong security awareness, training, understanding that unsolicited emails or phone calls we should be suspicious of. We want strong controls in place that are actively managed. We want our employees trained, not just once every couple of years we go through some mundane training that everybody hates. No, we want significant employee training so employees know what to look for, know to be suspicious. We want training on process and procedures and the policies that we're using. Excuse me, not just the casual, historic kind of view of policies where everybody hates to read them, signs them at the end, and we've checked that box. We don't want that in relation to these exposures. We want people to understand that the risks are real. We want security risk assessments. Typically, we want those annually, or we want them to be reviewed annually. We want to make progress toward any of the gaps that we see. We want to move toward this zero trust environment. And we really want to have this organization that's in control of their information. I've got a link at the bottom here that's the FBI's crime prevention tips, and it's actually pretty good. I think historically some of that has been a little fluff, but in the last couple of years they've taken a really serious approach to this, and so that's been really positive. So how do we get started? Let's take a look at where you are now. So what we want to do is take a look at your last or latest security risk assessment. Now, I understand that, maybe only 40 to 60% of the people on the webinar have done security risk assessments for their organizations. It's not unheard of that somebody hasn't done this. Some larger organizations have staff that's very, very on top of this. In the medical community, administrators know that this is SRAs are a requirement in order to meet compliance for HIPAA and other what they call MIPS and MACRA. So there's aggressive interest in getting security risk assessments there. On the accounting and legal and wealth management side, we've seen that those have been softer. So what we really want to do is get one of these done. We want a professional one done at the level of your organization. What they do is, and Netgain provides these as well, or does many of these as well, is really go into the organization and they look at all these control points. And they look at somewhere between 300 to 700 controls, depending on the size and complexity of your organization. And the goal there is just to get what's our state today. It's not to feel bad that we're not where we should be. It's just a really logical look of where are we just today. The output of that is really this remediation plan. It helped identify where there are gaps and then how are we going to solve that. So we want you to be able to take the results of that, even if you've done one previously, dust it off and see where are we on the gaps that were identified, what controls are missing. We want to get just, again, a factual representation of that. Next, and because it's straightforward and you can do in parallel, we want those employees getting real cybersecurity training. Now, we provide monthly 1-hour cybersecurity training, and I think many times there's continuing ed credits associated with that, so look for that. But what we really want is a structured plan for your employees. We don't want it to be casual. We don't want it to be, run through this video while you eat lunch. We want it to be very, very engaging. And so there's solutions out there around that really talk about that and really do a good job. Next, we want to talk about exposures. And what we've done that's been really successful is to do roundtables with senior management or the practice leadership and really talk about examples of how we're exposed today. And this can be somewhat emotional and it can be somewhat exposing. But the goal is to try and get consistent understanding in the organization of where are our risks, and we're going to address them. We're going to take an active stance and address these risks. Next, we want to do disaster recovery test. Now, many organizations that we've worked with historically before they become customers have had abysmal disaster recovery plans, have never really tested them, have backups of their data, hopefully, but many times have never tested those. And so we want your current IT provider to be able to walk you through what a disaster recovery test looks like and to be able to do one. And if you can't do one, to understand that and put that on the list of one of the remediation items you need to develop. What we really see in these last two items talk about it is that, excuse me, is that attacks are real with targeted phishing and a resulting ransomware. There's a significant amount of organizations that are hit every day. Not all of them make them in the news. Many people try and pay that ransom and get their data back. But that exposure, that breach, that incident ends up as a huge breach with ransomware. So we want to be very proactive here around getting an understanding of where you are today. So let's take a look at this next piece that talks about how do we fill the gaps of where we are. Again, we're going to look at that goal of having a zero trust footprint in the cybersecurity world. So the way to start that, let's validate who these users are. Now, historically, we've all had IDs and passwords to do this. The need and goal of complex passwords historically have been really, really high. The idea that you need separate accounts and separate passwords for every account that you log in across your life is there. What we want to do where we can, and for our organization internally, we want to use what they call multi-factor authentication. So this is typically provided by a user ID, a password, and then a confirmation back to, and today it's usually your mobile device. So you log in with your ID and password, your mobile device gets a notification that says somebody is logging in, is it you? And you say, yes, you approve that, and you get logged in. Some use PIN numbers that you have to enter. Some use text messages, which is somewhat less secure and can be hacked. But we want to be able to have that second, what they call second factor, to validate who you are. The FBI years ago came out and said this is really the closest thing they can come to with validation for that was the person who logged in. Next is that device authentication. There's solutions out there that, and you've seen it probably in your banking. Typically, it's banking where you would see this. I think actually Salesforce.com does this as well, where you log in, you've gone through your multi-factor, and it says, we've never seen this device before. And so they either then ask you an additional question or have you go through a second step to validate that this device is truly a device in your control. So we're seeing that now. And then what we want to do is have you do an internal review of security access and what your people have access to today. This can be both a technical review, in other words, your provider, IT provider, or internal staff can produce a list of what users have access to what, and then walk through that with you, and you can validate that, Johnny used to be in operations, now he moved over to finance. Well, he's still carrying all the access to operations. And at times, that's a good thing for that transition, but ultimately we want to remove him from that extra access. So going through that is an important piece. It really helps limit your exposure as an organization. Next, we want to do a security risk assessment, or we want you to have one done in the last year, and then pull that out and do that review. The next piece is vendor assessments. But what we see is in a lot of the exposures, and you can see them in the news ones as well, the exposure came through a vendor who's not you. The largest one that's kind of public was the Target one. Target got their credit card system hacked, and the way that the people got in was actually through the heating and air conditioning monitoring. So they figured out who was monitoring the heating and air conditioning system. They then broke into that company that was doing the monitoring and were able to cross that and get connected to Target's network. So we want to have you look at your vendors. Obviously the IT vendor, anyone who's got access to the facility, who's got access to where you keep records, where you have access to technology, So it's important to get those done. Next, and again, and I keep harping on this, we want those employees trained. So let's get that going. It's really no reason to wait on that. And it doesn't have to be an all-day thing. It can sure be in bites, so that every 2 months you're sitting through a half hour, an hour of training in order to get up to speed. The next piece, we want to really create a view of this at the senior level. And we see this specifically on the wealth management side, where there's a requirement that somebody gets named at the senior management level in charge of security and cybersecurity. We see it in some of the other compliance areas as well. Take this seriously. When I spoke to a large group of senior technologists a couple months ago, and they were all kind of lamenting the fact that, they need help, they need resources to implement better security. And then when I asked them, how is their relationship and are they talking to their management about this, most of them, kind of look away a little bit and say, well, they won't approve anything. And really, that's secondary. What we want here is a relationship in relation to this cybersecurity requirement. We want somebody from the leadership of the organization to understand this is a serious impact. Should there be a breach that's a public breach, which happens so quickly today, that the firm or the practice can be extremely damaged extremely quickly. So it's important to take this extremely seriously. The last thing is an add-on to that. In many organizations, we want an annual piece at a board meeting, or whoever your leadership is, if it's just partners associated with the firm. We want at least annually a cybersecurity report associated with what controls are exposed that haven't been mitigated, an overview of the total risk footprint of the organization, and then the future of the expected change over the next year. So again, we want exposure to really get this addressed.
One thing I'll add in here, Bill, too, and I think as we talk about building cybersecurity into part of the culture and the training to the employees, the goal obviously is to help employees be very focused and on high alert for some of these attacks that come in, because as you talked about, some of these organizations, these cyber crime organizations, are really getting quite brilliant when it comes to designing some of these attacks. And so, if there's a culture of awareness and alerting leadership when something is amiss, or when they suspect that something happened, really finding out about it early is going to be very important. Because if an employee felt, employees should feel empowered and encouraged to raise their hand if they feel like either they got a phishing email perhaps and maybe didn't take any action, but maybe more importantly, if they did take action and there is a possibility of that breach, that the employees are encouraged to come forward and share that, and so that comes down to a little bit of helping make sure that there's not that fear of punishment or retaliation, because that could be something where then they don't say anything or don't bring it forward, and then the issue just can escalate and replicate inside the organization and become even harder to stem the damage from. So I think just from a culture, promoting alerting management when something might be amiss, whether it might happen or already happened, I think will be good. Not feeling like you have to punish the employees for something happening.
Exactly. I think that's when we do some of the employee training, that's a big piece of it is you may realize that something's going on at the beginning. You get an email and it's a strange email and they're asking for something and, and so you want to delete that, forward that to somebody, talk about it. The piece that gets a little bit hairy is you've gotten an email from the CFO that's on vacation, and he's asking why this payment hasn't been done. This client has called him, and maybe 30 minutes later, you get a second email from him that's maybe now more demanding, and so you're trying to be responsive. And so a lot of times what we see is you get into this process before realizing something's going on. And, as humans, we try and be supportive and responsive and, it's our job and things like that, especially with clients as well. But what we really want to do is have a culture of exposure that says, hey, I'm all of a sudden uncomfortable. And so I'm not going to get punished for being uncomfortable. I'm going to talk about it now. This is the first time I'm recognizing it and really encouraging that in employees. So that's a great point, Phil. That's the culture we want in the organization. So let's look at the progress we can make today. And again, this is going to be a little bit redundant, but we're all in the midst of trying to get better at this. So let's go ahead and assign a senior staff owner of this if you haven't already. It can be anyone in the organization, really. Many times it's the CFO that's part of this, or IT leadership, or if you've got somebody specifically in administration that's responsible for the administrative controls, policies, and procedures, they're a good person to have, at least at the most senior person up that chain would be that person. Let's schedule that assessment or security review if you don't have one in the books. Let's look for those training opportunities and get people scheduled. And if you're one of the people on the webinar that's on the technical side, I don't want to say get our head out of the sand, but let's stand up and go talk to our leadership about this. Let's just get that going now. As you're looking at that security risk assessment, if you've got one done, or if you don't, let's plan on time and effort associated with fixing things, that remediation piece. And then let's work the plan. The last thing, and it's a partner of ours, KnowBe4. It's an organization that offers very, very inexpensive programmatic training and then phishing for all your employees. And it's a unique organization run by Kevin Mitnick, who's one of the kind of old-time biggest hackers that have been out there. But the focus here is really on getting employees to respond appropriately when they get requests for things that they should identify as coming from outside the organization. And so take a look at KnowBe4. It's a good way to get that training started quickly with really a low-cost solution. So take a look at that. So as we're starting to wrap this up, we want to talk a little bit about Netgain's advantage and why our customers choose Netgain and why some of you may ultimately choose us to help you with running either single applications or your whole IT infrastructure. We're really dramatically focused on this cybersecurity piece, both from training as well as technical infrastructure and technical controls. We help with those administrative controls as you become a client. and really get you to that point where you are a cybersecure organization. We allow and present solutions that allow your employees to work from anywhere. We leverage Microsoft's Azure environment, their hyperscale cloud environment, which is in today's world the most cybersecure platform that's out there for you to run your technology on. We provide really, really high touch service so that employees are never talked down to, and really present a cost-effective way for you to run IT going forward. Our goal is really to make it more of a utility, so it's always up, always available, always fast, and really treat everybody who has questions with the utmost care, and do that for a predictable, monthly cost, so that there aren't surprises anymore. So we really try and get you to that cybersecure organization as fast as possible.
One thing I'll add here too, Bill,
anything to add there?
Yeah, what I just want to add is, obviously we talked about the people component, the administrative controls that you can take with your cybersecurity, with them, training up your employees and making sure that everybody is ready to go. But as you mentioned, Bill, earlier, there's the administrative controls, the physical controls, things like, security cameras or badge access and restricting access, and the physical component, but then also the technical layer. And that's maybe where we come in, or another, organization that really focuses on cybersecurity and protecting and securing that data and those systems. And it's everything working together. We use the analogy internally here that we're helping defend the castle, right? So if you think about the administrative controls, the people component, maybe being the archers, or the helping make sure that the citizens are aware and keeping the castle safe. But then also there's the physical controls like a moat or or a drawbridge, and then the technical controls where maybe it's the hot tar or things like that. It's the point being that it's just there are different layers of security, and you don't want to just handle the technical controls, because the administrative controls, the people component, those people need to be trained up and following best practices. But it also can't be just focused on that. You need to have the technical controls on the back end too. So everything is kind of layered to really make sure that organization is as secure as possible and that all angles are covered.
Definitely, and we sure see that the cyber criminals know all about all three of those layers. And in an attack on an organization, they'll push on every piece of all three of those. So everything from, as strange as it might be, dumpster diving, materials coming out of the organization in the trash. So a physical control there. What can we find based on that? Can we find customer lists? Can we find other things? All the way up to the electronic technical controls that we put in place, and then the processes that, how do people handle financial transactions or health information? We sure see those administrative controls in place so that, even in a practice, as a doctor may be leaving an office after talking to a patient, that PC is locked or that terminal is locked, so no information is presented. So all those definitely fit together to protect the castle.
Perfect. Well, I think that brings us to kind of the question sort of that, Bill. So thanks so much for all of that. And I know we've got a couple questions that did pile up there that we'll address momentarily. So if you do have any last minute questions, make sure you get those into the question box, and we'll make sure to address them before we close. But before we get to those questions, I just wanted to quickly mention that we have had some really good feedback on some of these cybersecurity webinars that we've been rolling out and kind of building this into a series. So I think we're going to continue to keep it going on a monthly basis, just to help keep you and your staff aware and informed. So if you want to invite them to the next webinar or share the replays of past webinars, if you can feel free to do that. In the next session, we're going to be targeting it just after Thanksgiving, but really keeping an eye toward 2019 and talking about what cybersecurity trends folks might want to watch for. So just kind of wanted to put a plug out for that. We'll make sure to send you all the registration information soon, so you can be on the lookout. And then I know also sometimes even the smallest of cybersecurity precautions can make a really big difference. So for those of you on the webinar, if you'd like a webcam cover, that's just kind of one component of helping, that one of those security layers. Be happy to send you a webcam cover so you can better protect yourself from any spying hackers. So here, if you are interested, my email address is on the screen there. Feel free to email me and we'll make sure to get one sent out to you. And then also, so let's just go into the questions and then we'll wrap up. But Bill, we had a question from a training resources perspective. So I know you mentioned KnowBe4 as kind of one of those resources that folks could use to then handle some of those phishing attacks and do some of that internal testing. Are there any other resources where folks can go that from a training perspective, where they can get access to some of these training materials, or any advice that you can provide there?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, go to the compliance organization that you're a part of. Many times they have cybersecurity training along with compliance training, and so getting those lined up can be important. And then secondly, I think what we'll do, Phil, is just include a list of the top 3 resources or 4 resources in the email follow-up to this. So let's do that so that everybody kind of gets the same information.
Okay, great. Certainly we can include that. That's no problem. A question from Mary. She was wondering if cybersecurity training should be handled through an LMS, a learning management system, or if just having a lunch and learn and walking through some PowerPoint or some sort of presentation or some hands-on is more effective. Is one way going to be better than another for an organization, or does that just depend on the?
I think it's a good question. Everyone's busy, and so you want to take advantage of what you can. We like the learning management system approach, or the scheduled learning and validation, to just make sure everybody gets through. But then either doing a quarterly table talks as it relates to specific things, we see a lot of value in that, because if you just do the training without allowing your employees to provide feedback, ask questions, talk about scenarios. Everyone wants to talk about scenarios, and it's actually a good way to get information out and maybe control areas that somebody knows about, exposed, and then dealt with. So we really like having that, whether it's a lunch and learn roundtable that's led by management, or just kind of a focused discussion around why are we doing this. We think that's a really valuable piece to allow people to ask questions and really present information that the organization may not know.
Okay. All right, great. We had a question from Clint. He's wondering, is there a difference between information security and cybersecurity? I think that this one came in when we were talking about some definitions and terms. I feel like they're used interchangeably sometimes, but I think there is some difference there. Can you just walk us through those differences, Bill?
Yeah. So if you think about information security, we're specifically focusing on the information you may have associated with customers or other things that may be confidential. That could be printed information, that could be filed information, that could be in storage archives. So that ends up being a cross-section that includes cybersecurity, but also is more around the physical controls and access to that information. Some compliance organizations talk about an information security policy, And as part of that, they want a cybersecurity policy that's separate. So you'll see those two things addressed separately.
All right, perfect. And then we had just one final question from Tim. He's asking, in general, is a local on-premise server more secure than, let's say, information in Amazon's AWS or Microsoft's Azure cloud?
Sure, good question. We used to get this a lot. Maybe 10 years ago, and I remember answering. I was a larger organization, answering it with just a question of who cleaned your building. And well, they used a third-party service to clean the building. And the reality is that local piece of equipment is extremely exposed to anybody who can get physical access to the building. And unless you have unbelievably tight controls around that, and we did a webinar, I think last year, where we showed how to become a copy repair person and how to walk past and get approval to get access to technology in the back room as a copy person. And so that local physical equipment is significantly more exposed today than maybe 15 years ago. The world of Microsoft Azure and Amazon AWS really has the most amount of people and money focused on cybersecurity than anyone else in the world, except possibly some of the governments. All the sessions are encrypted. All the data at rest is encrypted. I heard a good example the other day that, even if an Amazon technical person inside Amazon wanted to get access to your stuff, it's encrypted in encryption keys they don't have access to, so they can't get access. So the world of, are we safer in these hyperscale clouds? The answer is dramatically yes. And you see that constantly as some of these breaches are physical breaches to organizations. And so, that piece changed quite a number of years ago, where that local equipment is much, much easier for somebody to get into.
Excellent. Perfect. I think that's as good as any as a spot to stop. But so as we just wrap up, as a reminder, we'll be emailing you in the next few days with a link to the on-demand replay of the webinar. We'll also include some of those top 3 or 4 resources that you can look for accessing cybersecurity training materials. And then in the meantime, if you do have any additional questions from today's webinar, Bill's contact information is on the screen, so you can reach out to him there. We've also created a lot of blog and ebook content around this topic, so you can always check out our resource center at netgaincloud.com/blog. You see a link on the screen there for our cybersecurity toolkit. We just came out with that, and that's been a hit so far too. But it's just a really good collection of some desk reference guides, things you can share with your employees, action steps that you can take today and over the next few months, or to help protect your organization as well too. So the link to download that is on the screen there. So I would encourage you to check that out. And that's been a hit too. But Bill, I want to thank you for taking some time out today. I know you're doing some traveling and calling in remote, so really appreciate you carving out some time to talk to us today.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, and we really appreciate you taking time to listen and ask questions. The response to these has been extremely significant. So we're going to obviously continue to provide this kind of content on a monthly basis. And again, just really appreciate your input in these as well.
Couldn't have said it better. Yep. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and we will see you next time.